In the dim corners of Elmsbury, a town veiled more by its secrets than the perennial fog that hugged its cobblestones, there lay a tapestry of stories untold, horrors unexplained. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the happenings on the fringes of their reality, odd disappearances, whispers in the walls, shadows that swayed against the logic of light. One particularly frosty evening, as the fog thickened, consuming the streets like a ravenous beast, Margaret Evans walked briskly down Willow Lane. Her steps echoed against the damp, narrow path, overshadowed by towering, ancient oaks that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets as old as time itself. Margaret clutched her coat tightly around her, sensing an unnerving presence that tugged at the edges of her mind, causing her heart to race with an instinctual fear. "Quite a dreary night for a walk, isn't it?" came a voice, sudden and chilling, slicing through the dense fog. Margaret spun around, her eyes wide, scanning the opaque veil. There was no one. The street was deserted, her breath misted in the cold air as she hastened her steps. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling as much as her hands. No answer came, only the soft rustling of the leaves, and the distant, melancholic howl of the wind. Margaret's home was a quaint, Victorian-era house at the end of the lane. As she approached, the gate creaked ominously, swinging gently in the ghostly breeze. The door, she found oddly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her into the unknown. Her heart pounded as she pushed it open, the old wood groaning under her touch. Inside, the house was silent, too silent, as if suffocated by the thick layers of unseen dread. Margaret flicked the light switch. The bulb flickered reluctantly before bathing the room in a dim, eerie glow. Shadows danced across the walls, their forms ambiguous and menacing. As she ventured further into the depths of her home, a sudden chill swept through the room, the temperature plummeting. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, casting the house into intermittent darkness. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself, her voice a mere whisper in the overpowering silence that enveloped her. In the living room, the air felt heavier, charged with a palpable tension. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she noticed the portrait on the wall. It was of her late husband, George, who had died under mysterious circumstances years ago. His eyes, usually calm and comforting, seemed tonight to pierce through her, filled with an inexplicable malice. "George," she called out, half in hope, half in a rising panic. The room responded with a low groan that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Then, the unthinkable happened. The portrait began to sway gently, as if nudged by an invisible hand. Margaret recoiled in horror, her back pressing against the cold wall. The room grew colder, the air thicker, as if something, or someone, was manifesting. A faint whisper filled the room, echoing around her, "Leave, now." Ignoring the warning, Margaret's determination overrode her fear. She needed answers. Why had her normally peaceful home turned into a house of horrors? What had happened to George? And why now? As she delved deeper into the mystery, exploring each room, the phenomena intensified. Books flew off shelves, doors slammed shut, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways, always just out of sight. Her mind raced as she pieced together the fragmented events, each more puzzling and terrifying than the last. It was in the attic, under the light of a flickering bulb, that she found the old, leather-bound book that George had often told her never to touch. Its pages were worn, filled with strange symbols and writings in a language she didn't recognize. As she opened it, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the light and plunging her into darkness. Whispers swirled around her, growing louder, more insistent. "Put it back," they hissed. "Put it back." Heart pounding, breath shallow, Margaret clutched the book to her chest. She knew, in this moment, that the answers she sought were within these pages, these cursed pages that held secrets not meant for the living. As she prepared to read, the shadows around her deepened, and a voice, clearer now, warned, "Some mysteries are not meant to be solved." But it was too late. Margaret's curiosity had led her down a path from which there was no return. The whispers grew into shouts, the shadows into forms, and as she read the first line aloud, the true horror of her situation revealed itself. The room spun, the floor beneath her seemed to give way, and she was plunged into a world of unspeakable terror. As Margaret faced the consequences of her actions, the story of Elmsbury's darkest mysteries began to unfold. Each word she read tied her fate closer to the town's haunted past, revealing connections that she could never have imagined. But the full scope of the horror was yet to be uncovered. The night grew darker, the fog thicker, and as the boundary between the living and the dead blurred, the true terror of Elmsbury was just beginning to reveal itself. The question remained, would Margaret, or any who dared to follow, survive the chilling truths buried within these tales? The answer, like the deepest fears of Elmsbury, remained shrouded in the dense, impenetrable fog of the unknown. The book's pages fluttered as if caught in a relentless storm, each turn revealing horrors more profound and terrifying than the last. Margaret's eyes darted across the ancient script, absorbing tales of curses laid long before the town was even founded, of spirits bound to the earthly realm through unspeakable acts. The whispering intensified, a cacophony of desperate, anguished voices, as if the very souls entwined in the book's legacy were clawing at the edges of reality, seeking escape or perhaps retribution. In her dimly lit attic, the shadows grew denser, coalescing into shapes that defied the laws of physics and reason. Margaret felt the air around her grow thick, almost viscous, as if she were wading through a swamp of her fears and darkest thoughts. The temperature dropped further, her breath now visible, puffing out in frantic, white clouds that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness enveloping her. She read about a witch, scorned and betrayed by the townspeople of Elmsbury, who had cursed the land as flames consumed her, a curse that promised misery and death to those who dared to disturb her rest. Margaret's hand trembled as she held the book, the realization dawning upon her that her husband's death might have been entwined with this very curse. George had been obsessed with the town's history, delving into its darkest corners, perhaps too deeply. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath her, and a cold draft snaked up her spine, sending shivers cascading down her body. A shadow darted past the corner of her eye, so quick, so fleeting, she might have dismissed it as a trick of the light, if not for the accompanying whisper, so close it felt like a breath upon her ear. He knew. Heart racing, she flipped through the pages more frantically, seeking answers, her fingers numb with cold and fear. Each story seemed to bleed into the next, a man who vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a pile of ash and a pair of smoldering shoes, a child who could speak with the dead, her innocent mind overwhelmed by the secrets she learned until one day, she too disappeared, her laughter echoing eternally down the empty halls of her family home. Suddenly, the attic window shattered, a blast of cold air hurling the fragments inward, scattering them like diamond shards across the wooden floor. Margaret screamed, a short, sharp sound of shock and terror, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The book fell from her numb fingers, landing open on the floor, its pages fluttering wildly as if desperate to continue their tale without her. She crawled toward it, driven by a need to understand, to connect the dots between past and present, her mind racing with the possibilities of her own role in this macabre history. As she reached out, a shadow loomed over the book, large and imposing. She looked up slowly, her gaze climbing the dark figure's form until she met its eyes, hollow sockets that stared back with a malevolence that froze her soul. The figure, cloaked in darkness, seemed to pulse with an unholy life. Its voice, when it spoke, was a chorus of the damned, a sound so chilling it seemed to scrape the very warmth from the air. "Why do you disturb the past that wishes only to sleep?" it demanded, its tone a blend of curiosity and threat. Margaret's voice was but a whisper, cracked and small. "I need to know, about George, about all of this." The figure's shadow swirled around her, enveloping her in darkness as it leaned closer, its presence oppressive, suffocating. "The past is alive because of those who refuse to forget," it hissed. "Your husband knew the price of his curiosity. Do you wish to pay it as well?" She felt an icy grip tighten around her heart. Fear, pure and raw, coursed through her veins, but so did a surge of determination. She needed to know if there was a way to end the curse, to free her home and herself from this nightmare. "Tell me how to stop this," she pleaded, her voice stronger now, driven by a newfound resolve. The figure recoiled slightly, as if surprised by her audacity. It then laughed, a sound that echoed like the ringing of a death knell. "The path to salvation is fraught with peril, Margaret. To seek it is to walk a road paved with madness and despair. Are you prepared to tread such a path?" Margaret nodded, her resolve steeling her. "I am." The figure seemed to consider her for a moment, its form blurring, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. "Very well," it murmured. "But be warned, the truth you seek may not set you free. It may instead bind you to the darkness forever." As the figure dissipated, the shadows retreating as if in deference to her courage, Margaret felt a momentary relief, a brief respite in the eye of a storm. She picked up the book once more, its pages now calm, almost beckoning. She knew the journey ahead would be fraught with danger, each step leading her deeper into the heart of Elmsbury's darkness, a town haunted not just by the spirits of the past, but by the shadows of unsolved mysteries that refused to die. The night was still young, and as the wind held through the broken window, stirring the curtains like the whispers of the damned, Margaret prepared herself for the ordeal to come. The answers she sought lay somewhere in the depths of the cursed town, hidden in shadows that danced on the edge of sight, in whispers that echoed through the halls of derelict houses, in the very air that breathed the past into the present. Her quest for understanding had only just begun, and as the moon rose higher, casting a ghostly pallor over Elmsbury, it was clear that the horrors that awaited her were as deep and enduring as the mysteries they sprang from. The night, like the book in her trembling hands, was far from over, and the tales it had to tell were many and more terrifying than any could imagine. Margaret stood alone in the cold, quiet darkness of her attic, the broken window allowing the night's chill to seep through, wrapping its icy fingers around her. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from the realization of the daunting path she had resolved to walk. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each more disturbing than the last. Had George stumbled upon the same cursed knowledge, and had it led to his untimely demise? With the leather-bound tome clutched tightly to her chest, she made her way downstairs, each step creaking ominously under her weight, as if the house itself protested her descent into the night that awaited her. Outside, Elmsbury was shrouded in a dense fog, the street lamps casting ghostly halos that barely penetrated the mist. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a testament to the town's age and the secrets buried beneath its soil. Margaret's breath misted in the air, merging with the fog, as she started down the path leading away from her home, her destination unknown yet compelled by an invisible force that seemed guided by the cursed knowledge she now possessed. As she walked, the streets of Elmsbury twisted and turned in ways she did not remember, as if the town itself had changed shape, morphing into something otherworldly. The familiar houses appeared foreboding, their windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of skulls staring back at her. Shadows moved just beyond the corner of her vision, darting between the trees and buildings, whispering in a language that was both alien and terrifying. She passed the old cemetery, its gates wrought iron and twisted, entwined with vines that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The gravestones stood like silent sentinels, covered in moss and lichen, their inscriptions worn away by time. A cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it voices that were too faint to fully grasp, but filled Margaret with a dread that tightened her chest, making it hard to breathe. The path she followed led to the outskirts of town, to the old mill that sat abandoned by the river. The building was a relic of a bygone era, its timbers rotting, the wheel still, covered in moss and dangling vines. The river beside it flowed silently, its waters dark and mysterious, reflecting neither moon nor star, but seeming to absorb all light, becoming a mirror to the darkness of the night itself. Margaret's footsteps echoed hollowly as she entered the mill, the wood creaking ominously under her feet. The air inside was musty, filled with the smell of decay and old water. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she could make out the shapes of old machinery, rusted and silent, their purpose long forgotten. The windows were thick with grime, the moonlight struggling to penetrate the filth, casting weak beams that did little to dispel the gloom. As she ventured deeper into the mill, her flashlight beam caught something in the far corner, a figure, hunched and shadowy, its features obscured by darkness. Margaret froze, her heart thumping in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. The figure remained motionless, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. Slowly, cautiously, she approached, the light of her flashlight trembling along with her hands. The wind whispered through the broken windows of the mill, carrying with it voices from the past, echoes of the souls who had once lived and died in Elmsbury. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, something watched, its intentions unreadable, waiting for her next move. The game, it seemed, was far from over, and the night had many more stories to tell. Gathering her strength, Margaret rose from the dusty floor of the old mill, her muscles stiff, her body protesting every movement with a sharp reminder of the terror she had just faced. Her mind, however, could not afford to dwell on her fatigue. It was consumed by a relentless drive to uncover the truth behind the curse that plagued Elmsbury. The book, now her constant and heavy companion, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own, its secrets seared into her brain, each word a whisper of ancient and forbidden knowledge. Outside, the night remained as dark and oppressive as ever, the fog thicker, if possible, smothering the town under a heavy, wet blanket that muffled sounds and obscured sights. Margaret's flashlight, its beam weak and flickering, barely cut through the gloom as she made her way back towards the heart of Elmsbury. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally loud in her ears, as if the night itself was listening, watching her every move with unseen eyes. The streets of Elmsbury twisted before her, the familiar becoming foreign, as if the town itself was alive, shifting its pathways to confuse or, perhaps, to lead her. She passed houses that seemed to lean closer as she walked by, their windows dark and empty, yet filled with a palpable sense of watching, waiting. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something foul, like decay and old blood mixed together, a scent that seemed to follow her, clinging to her clothes, her skin. As she neared the center of town, the square with its ancient fountain, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble slightly, a subtle vibration that grew in intensity with each step. The fountain, a grotesque sculpture of winged beasts and weeping cherubs, stood silent, its water long since dried up, but tonight it seemed different. The cherubs' faces, usually benign if melancholic, now twisted in expressions of horror and pain, their stone eyes weeping real tears that stained the cracked basin below. Margaret stopped, her heart pounding, as the ground shook more violently, the tremors strong enough now to rattle the windows in the surrounding buildings. A sound, low and grinding, like the earth itself was groaning in pain, filled the air, growing louder, more insistent. She looked around, panicked, searching for the source of the noise, when the ground in front of the fountain began to crack, the stone splitting with a sharp, echoing snap. From the fissure, a thick, black mist began to rise, swirling and coalescing into a dense cloud that hovered over the square. The air around it chilled rapidly, frost forming on the ground, creeping outward from the base of the fountain. Margaret backed away, her mind racing, trying to connect this new horror with the tales from the book. The ground continued to shake, the fissure widening as if something was about to emerge. Frozen in place, Margaret could only watch as the black mist began to take shape, forming a tall, thin figure, its features obscured by the swirling darkness that composed its body. A pair of gleaming, red eyes cut through the mist, fixing on Margaret with an intensity that burned into her very soul. "Do you understand now?" a voice boomed, deep and resonant, emanating from the figure. It was not a question born of curiosity, but of condemnation. "Do you see the depths of your folly?" Margaret's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the rumbling ground. "What are you? What do you want?" As she drew nearer, the figure became clearer. It was not a person, but a mannequin, its clothing tattered and faded, its face featureless, yet somehow menacing. A chill ran down Margaret's spine as she realized it was not alone. There were others, positioned around the room, each dressed in remnants of what might once have been the mill workers' clothes. They stood silent, a tableau of the damned, their blank faces turned towards her, as if they had been waiting for her all this time. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to understand the significance of this macabre scene. Was this some remnant of a past tragedy, a moment frozen in time by some terrible event? Or was it something more sinister, a warning or a sign of some curse that lingered in this place? She turned to leave, her nerves frayed, her resolve shaken, but as she did, the sound of creaking wood filled the air, loud and sudden. She whipped around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, and saw that the mannequins had moved. They were now closer, their positions changed, arms reaching out, their featureless faces seeming to leer at her from the shadows. Panic gripped her, cold and sharp, as she realized she was not alone. Something was with her in the mill, something unseen and malevolent, manipulating these grotesque puppets. She backed away, her steps quick and unsteady, her flashlight beam darting from one figure to another, confirming her worst fears. They were closing in, slowly, inexorably, their intentions as dark as the night that enveloped them. Margaret's back hit a wall, solid and unyielding, and she realized with a sinking feeling that she had unwittingly trapped herself. The figures were all around her now, their cold, empty faces inches from her own, their tattered clothes rustling in the non-existent wind. She could feel their cold breath, smell the decay of their garb, and beneath that, something fouler, the stench of death and forgotten graves. Her mind raced for a solution, a way to escape, but the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing. It was then that she remembered the book, still clutched tightly in her hand. She fumbled to open it, her fingers numb with terror, the pages seeming to resist her efforts. But finally, it opened, and she read aloud, her voice trembling, the words a chant of desperation and hope. As she spoke, the air around her began to shimmer, the darkness pulsating as if in response to her voice. The figures halted their advance, their heads cocking as if listening. The atmosphere thickened, electric and charged, and a sound like thunder rolled through the building, shaking the foundations. Margaret continued to read, her voice growing stronger, more confident. The words of the book seemed to fill her, lending her their power, their promise of release from this nightmare. The figures began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into the air, becoming nothing more than motes of dust that danced in the beam of her flashlight. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The figures were gone, the oppressive presence that had filled the mill dissipated, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the gentle flow of the river outside. Exhausted, shaken, but alive, Margaret sank to the floor, the book still open in her lap. She knew this was only the beginning, that there were more secrets to uncover, more horrors to face. But for now, she was safe, and that was enough. The night was still young, and Elmsbury, with its twisted streets and dark secrets, waited for her. As she gathered her strength, preparing to continue her journey into the heart of the town's darkness, she knew that whatever awaited her, she was no longer the same woman who had left her home that evening. She was a seeker of truths, however dark they might be, and she would not stop until she had unraveled the mysteries that had haunted her town for so long. "I am the keeper of the curse, the guardian of the secrets you so foolishly seek," the figure replied, its voice a blend of sadness and rage. "This town, cursed from its foundation, rests on the brink of destruction, and you, with your meddling, risk everything. But there has to be a way to stop this, to end the curse," Margaret protested, her voice gaining strength as her fear transformed into determination. "There must be something in the book." "The book," the figure spat the words as if they were an affront. "The book is but a chain, a link to the past, binding these horrors to your world. Every word you read, every secret you uncover, only tightens that chain, drawing the darkness closer." Margaret felt the weight of the book in her hand, heavier now, as if it bore the weight of all Elmsbury's damned souls. "So, what am I to do? Just accept this? There must be a way to break the chain." The figure loomed closer, the black mist swirling violently around it. "The path you seek is fraught with peril greater than you can imagine. To break the chain, you must undo the very foundations of this curse, a task that has destroyed all who have dared to try before you." Determined, yet chilled to her core, Margaret nodded slowly. "Tell me what I need to do. I have to try." The figure regarded her for a moment, its red eyes burning with a fierce, ancient intelligence. "Very well," it intoned. "To break the curse, you must find the heart of it, the original source of the darkness that binds this town. You must go back to where it all began, to the old church, abandoned and feared, where the first curse was cast." Margaret knew of the church, a place shunned by the townspeople, where no one dared to go, especially after dark. Its spire, broken and jagged, pierced the skyline on the edge of town, its windows boarded, its doors sealed. A shiver ran down her spine at the thought of what might await her there, but she steeled herself. The path ahead was clear, and however treacherous, it was the only way to save her town, and perhaps her own soul. Taking a deep breath, she turned towards the church, her resolve firm. As she stepped forward, the ground still trembling beneath her feet, the figure in the mist began to fade, its final words echoing in the chilling wind. "Beware, Margaret Evans, for the darkness is not easily swayed, and its vengeance knows no bounds." With the echo of those ominous words in her ears, Margaret walked into the night, each step taking her closer to the heart of the curse, closer to the ancient church, and closer to the unknown horrors that awaited her in the darkness. The town of Elmsbury, with its twisted paths and haunted silences, seemed to watch her go, its secrets veiled in the thick fog that lay like a shroud over everything. The journey ahead was fraught with dangers she could only begin to imagine, but she knew there was no turning back now. The story of Elmsbury was far from over, and the night still had many tales to tell. Margaret's journey through the foggy streets of Elmsbury, towards the forsaken church, was fraught with a sense of mounting dread that clung to her like the damp night air itself. Her footsteps echoed against the cobblestones, a lonely, rhythmic sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the night. The streets were deserted, as if the town itself had retreated in fear of what might unfold this very night. As she neared the church, the air grew colder, the fog denser, as though the very atmosphere was trying to deter her from approaching the cursed place. The church stood on a slight rise, its silhouette a jagged shadow against the less dark night sky, its spire, broken and jagged, pointing accusingly at the heavens. The building was surrounded by an old cemetery, the gravestones crooked and covered in moss, standing like silent sentinels guarding a secret too horrific to tell. The gate to the cemetery creaked ominously as Margaret pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a sharp intake of breath. She stepped onto the path leading up to the church, her flashlight beam cutting a swath through the mist, illuminating patches of overgrown grass and the crumbling stones of long-forgotten graves. The air was thick with the smell of decay, not just the decay of leaves and wood, but something older, a rot that spoke of decayed hopes and festering secrets. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a loud drum that seemed to resonate through the ground, as if calling forth the spirits buried beneath. The wind picked up, a mournful howl that seemed to carry with it voices of the past, whispering secrets and warnings. She could almost make out words, entreaties woven through the wind, urging her to turn back, to flee the darkness before it swallowed her whole. But she pressed on, driven by a need to confront whatever lay at the heart of this curse, to face it head on, no matter the cost. The path twisted unexpectedly, leading her between tombstones that leaned towards her as if eager to share their tales of woe. Her flashlight flickered, casting dancing shadows that twisted into grotesque shapes, making her jump back, her heart racing even faster. Finally, she reached the church itself, its once grand doors now warped and stained with age, their paint peeling away to reveal the rotting wood beneath. The large, circular window above the entrance, which once held a magnificent stained glass depiction of a biblical scene, was now but a gaping hole, dark and foreboding, like an eye that stared into the deepest recesses of her soul. Margaret approached the doors, her hands trembling as she reached out to push them open. They resisted at first, as if sealed by the years of fear and superstition that clung to the place. With a determined push, they groaned open, revealing the dark maw of the church interior, a void that seemed to breathe, exhaling a cold, damp breath that smelled of mildew and old stone. Inside, the church was cavernous, the remnants of pews lying broken and scattered across the floor. The altar at the far end was barely visible, shrouded in shadows that seemed almost solid, so dense was the darkness. Margaret's flashlight seemed feeble in the vast darkness of the church, the beam swallowed almost as soon as it left her hand. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing off the high, arched ceilings, each echo seeming to be answered by a soft, skittering sound, as if something or things moved just beyond the edge of her light. The air inside was cold, colder than the night air outside, and carried a palpable sense of despair that weighed on her, pressing down like a physical force. As she walked down the central aisle, her flashlight beam fell upon the altar, and she gasped. There, spread across the stone surface, were dozens of candles, their wicks black and long burnt out, surrounding an open book. The book looked ancient, its cover a patchwork of leather and strange, dark metal, its pages open as if waiting for her. Margaret approached slowly, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The book seemed to call to her, its pages rustling softly, although there was no wind inside the church. She reached out a trembling hand to touch it, her fingers just inches away when a sudden, sharp noise made her jump back. The candles around the book ignited spontaneously, one after the other, their flames casting an eerie, flickering light across the church, throwing long, sinister shadows against the walls. Frozen in place, Margaret watched as the shadows began to move, twisting and writhing as if alive. A low, murmuring voice filled the air, echoing around her, words indistinguishable but tone unmistakable, anger, sorrow, and an immense, unbearable longing. She realized then that she was not alone. The church, the very air around her, was alive with the spirits of those bound to this cursed place. Their presence crowded in on her, pressing close, their whispered voices growing louder, more insistent. She could feel their pain, their anger, their desperate desire for release from their eternal bondage. Margaret knew she had to act, to use the knowledge she had gained, to break the chain of curses that held these souls and the town of Elmsbury in its grip. But as she prepared to speak, to cast the spell or incantation that would free them, the church seemed to react, the very stones groaning in protest, the shadows deepening, threatening. She was on the brink of something profound, a revelation that could change everything, but the path she had to walk was fraught with peril, lined with shadows that reached for her, voices that called to her from the dark, each step forward a battle against forces both seen and unseen. And as the candles flickered, casting their dubious light, the book lay open, a beacon and a challenge, the key to ending the curse, or perhaps deepening it. The night was far from over, and the darkness held its breath, waiting for her next move. Margaret's heart pounded with a ferocity that threatened to break free from her chest as the whispers crescendoed into an almost palpable chorus of despair and fury. The air within the church thickened, growing colder with each passing moment as if the very atmosphere was compressing under the weight of the unseen forces that now made their presence overwhelmingly known. Each breath she took seemed to draw in more than just air. It was as though she was inhaling the sorrow of the ages, the remnants of unfulfilled lives and unquiet spirits that lingered in this forsaken place. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed themselves on the ancient book lying open on the altar. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows across its pages, which were filled with archaic script and strange, unsettling illustrations that seemed to twist and move in the corners of her vision, as if alive. The symbols, dark and cryptic, pulsed with a sinister energy, drawing her in, urging her to read aloud the words that might free or condemn her. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Margaret stepped closer to the altar, her steps cautious, reverent, as if she was aware that each footfall was a note in the symphony of rituals that this place demanded. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of sounds that were at once terrifying and pitiful. They seemed to be both warning her away and pleading with her to proceed, a testament to the dual nature of the curse that bound them. "Release us," they moaned, their voices overlapping, blending into a litany of desperation. Margaret reached out a trembling hand to the book. The moment her fingers brushed the ancient pages, a shockwave of energy coursed through her, stark and electrifying, as if the book itself had been waiting for her touch to awaken fully from its long slumber. The pages turned of their own accord, stopping on a section that seemed to have been marked for this very moment, the script glowing faintly under the flickering light of the candles. She leaned forward to read the text, her voice barely above a whisper at first, but growing in strength as she spoke the words that had the power to undo centuries of darkness. The air around her vibrated with the power of her incantations, the church responding with groans and creaks, as if the building itself was in pain. As she continued, the shadows around her swirled and coalesced into forms that were human in shape, but grotesque in their manifestation, faces distorted by grief, bodies twisted in agony. They circled around her, a macabre audience bound by chains unseen, their eyes hollow yet filled with a haunting, pleading intensity. Margaret could feel their pain, their hope, their terrible thirst for liberation, and it fueled her resolve. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as if the very earth was reacting to the power of the ancient words. A wind began to rise within the confines of the church, a howling gale that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, whipping around her, driving the spirits back with its ferocity. Yet, Margaret stood firm, her voice now loud and clear, resonant with the authority of one who has come to terms with her destiny. "By the power of these words, the chains of the past shall be broken," she declared, her voice echoing through the vast, shadow-filled nave. "Let the spirits of Elmsbury find peace, let this curse be lifted, and let the darkness recede into the light." As she spoke the final words, a blinding light burst forth from the book, enveloping her in its brilliance. The candles flickered wildly, then extinguished, plunging the church into darkness save for the radiant glow emanating from the altar. The spirits, their forms momentarily illuminated by the pure, white light, appeared to be lifted, their chains dissolving into nothingness, their expressions transforming from one of agony to one of peace. The wind died down as suddenly as it had arisen, and a heavy silence filled the church, profound and complete. Margaret felt the energy recede, leaving her drained, her knees weak. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, the book still open before her, its pages now blank, as if everything that had been written there had been a mere illusion. But the peace was short-lived. The darkness began to creep back, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as if angered by the brief moment of light. The temperature dropped, a coldness seeping into her bones, and the heavy silence was shattered by a new sound, one that chilled her to the core, a low, menacing growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the church itself. Margaret's heart, which had just begun to slow, raced once again. She realized with a sinking feeling that whatever she had done was not enough, or perhaps it had been too much. The curse was not merely a chain to be broken, it was a living, breathing entity of its own, and it was angry. As she struggled to her feet, the growling intensified, joined now by a scraping sound, as if something with claws was dragging itself across the stone floor towards her. The darkness was almost complete, suffocating, and she knew that she had to move, to escape the church before whatever lurked in its shadows found her. Her flashlight, dropped in the chaos, lay just out of reach, its beam flickering weakly on the floor. Crawling on her hands and knees, she reached for it, her fingers just brushing against the cold metal when a sharp, searing pain exploded in her ankle. She screamed, not just from the pain, but from the fear of what had her, what unseen horror had crept up in the darkness. Dragging herself away, Margaret's hand finally closed around the flashlight, and she swung it around, its beam cutting through the blackness. For a moment, it illuminated a figure, hunched and horrific, its eyes glowing red, its mouth a gaping maw filled with sharp, jagged teeth. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her ankle, and ran, her only thought to get out of the church, to escape the darkness that sought to claim her. The growls chased her, echoing through the church as she limped towards the entrance, the doors now seeming miles away. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her injured ankle throbbing with each step, but fear propelled her forward, lending her a speed born of desperation. Behind her, the creature pursued, its footsteps a heavy, ominous thud that seemed to shake the ground. As she reached the doors, throwing them open with a strength she didn't know she possessed, the cold night air hit her like a wave, but it was the freshest breath she had ever taken. Stumbling out into the cemetery, she didn't stop to look back, her mind focused solely on escape, on survival. The church receded into the background as she made her way through the gravestones, the growls fading but still present, a reminder that the horror was not confined to the church, that it had perhaps been unleashed, more furious and potent than ever. Margaret knew she had to find a way to truly end this, to find a solution that the book had not provided, or perhaps that she had not understood. Elmsbury, with its dark, twisted paths and haunted history, was no longer just her home, it was her battleground. As she fled into the night, the moon peeking through the clouds to cast a pale, uncertain light on her path, the true depth of her challenge was just beginning to dawn on her. The night was far from over, and the shadows that stretched before her seemed endless, each one a dark promise of the struggles yet to come. Margaret's frantic escape through the cemetery was a blur of shadow and moonlight, her breaths ragged and sharp in the cold night air. Each step forward was a defiance of the terror that clawed at her heels, an unseen yet palpable presence that seemed to grow with every heartbeat, fueled by the dark energy she had unwittingly unleashed. The once familiar paths of the cemetery now twisted unnaturally, like the gnarled fingers of a malevolent hand, guiding her towards a fate she dared not imagine. The ancient tombstones, worn by time and weather, stood like silent witnesses to her plight, their inscriptions obscured by moss and creeping ivy, symbols of forgotten lives that mirrored the haunting ephemera of her own desperate flight. Behind her, The sounds of pursuit grew louder, more determined, a symphony of growls and heavy, dragging footsteps that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. Margaret knew she could not outrun this creature forever. The pain in her ankle was a sharp, constant reminder of her physical limits. She needed to think, to find a strategy that could end this nightmare once and for all. Her mind raced, connecting fragments of ancient lore with the chilling realities she had faced, searching for a clue, a solution hidden within the layers of fear and confusion that enveloped her. Suddenly, ahead in the moonlit darkness, the old chapel loomed, its small, decrepit structure a stark contrast to the imposing church she had fled. An idea sparked in Margaret's terror-clouded mind. Perhaps this place, with its own sacred ground, could offer some respite, some power to combat the darkness. With the last reserves of her strength, she pushed forward, her limping gait a painful lurch towards potential salvation. Reaching the chapel, Margaret shoved the creaking wooden door open, the rusted hinges protesting loudly in the quiet of the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old, forgotten books. She quickly scanned her surroundings. It was a simple, one-room building, with an altar at the front, upon which lay a cross and a Bible, both coated in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. Here, in this place of faded holiness, Margaret felt a faint, pulsing hope. She limped to the altar, her hands trembling as she picked up the cross, its surface cold and oddly comforting against her palm. Turning to face the door, she waited, the cross held out before her like a shield, as the sound of her pursuer's approach grew ever nearer. The creature burst through the chapel door with a force that sent splinters flying through the air. It was more terrifying than she had imagined, its body a mass of shadows, with eyes that burned red in the dim light of the chapel. It paused, seeming to recoil slightly at the sight of the cross in Margaret's hands, its snarl a mixture of fury and frustration. "Back!" Margaret's voice was a commanding shout, strengthened by fear and resolve. "By this symbol, I command you, back into the darkness from whence you came." The creature hesitated, its form wavering, as if struggling against an unseen force. Margaret seized the moment, her voice rising in a chant of exorcism she recalled from the depths of her memory, words passed down through generations meant to protect against the darkest evils. As she chanted, the chapel seemed to respond, the very walls vibrating with a power that grew with each word she spoke. The air grew brighter, as if light itself was seeping into the room, casting away shadows, filling the space with a palpable force of good. The creature howled, a sound of agony and rage, as it began to dissolve, the shadows that formed its body dissipating like smoke in the wind. It tried to advance, to fight against the light and the sacred words, but it was losing, its form becoming less defined, its growls weaker. Finally, with a last, desperate scream, it vanished completely, leaving behind only the echo of its despair, and then, silence, a profound, all-encompassing silence that filled the chapel like a benediction. Margaret collapsed to her knees, exhausted, the cross still clutched in her hands. She had done it. She had driven the darkness back. Tears of relief and pain streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat and grime of her ordeal. She knew this victory was but a moment in the ongoing battle between light and darkness, but it was a victory nonetheless. As she rested there, on the cold stone floor, the first rays of dawn began to filter through the stained glass windows of the chapel, casting colorful, dancing patterns across the walls and floor. In this new light, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known for what seemed like an eternity. Her journey was not over. There were still many mysteries to unravel about Elmsbury and the darkness that lay at its heart. But for now, she had won a crucial battle, and in the light of the rising sun, she felt renewed, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With the morning light strengthening around her, Margaret rose, her body sore but her spirit invigorated. She stepped out of the chapel into the dawn of a new day, the air fresh and clear, the terror of the night banished by her courage and resolve. The path forward would be fraught with dangers, but Margaret knew she was no longer alone. The light was with her, and she was ready to continue her fight, to protect her town, and to seek out the lingering shadows that still whispered in the depths of Elmsbury. The story of her battle against the darkness was far from over, and she was prepared to face it, head on, with all the strength of her newfound faith and resolve. As Margaret stepped out of the chapel, the light of dawn casting long shadows on the ground, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, yet the sense of unfinished business loomed large in her heart. The town of Elmsbury, with its dark secrets and whispered horrors, still held many mysteries she was yet to uncover. However, she knew that the immediate threat had been subdued, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a shimmer of hope. Walking back through the streets of Elmsbury, now silent and bathed in the soft morning light, Margaret saw the town as if for the first time. The menacing feel of the shadows had diminished, and the houses that had once seemed to leer at her with darkened windows now appeared merely old and worn by time. The town was waking up, the nightmare of the night fading with the rising sun, but the memories of what had transpired would not be so easily erased. As she passed the familiar landmarks, the old fountain, the twisting paths of the cemetery, Margaret reflected on the events that had led her here. She had confronted her fears, faced unimaginable horrors, and come out alive. But the victory was not just hers alone. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of faith, and the strength that comes from confronting one's darkest fears. Determined to ensure no one else would suffer as she had, Margaret decided to document her experiences. She began gathering all the knowledge she had acquired, the lore of Elmsbury, the tales of the cursed church, and her own personal encounters. She spent days, then weeks, writing everything down, her notes becoming a manuscript that detailed the darkness, but also how to combat it. Once her work was complete, she approached the town council. Initially met with skepticism, her conviction and the undeniable evidence of the horrors that had befallen the town swayed their minds. The council agreed to establish a watch, a group dedicated to safeguarding the town, using Margaret's manuscript as their guide. They became the keepers of the light, a beacon against the darkness that lingered in the unseen corners of Elmsbury. Years passed, and while peace seemed to have returned, the town never forgot. Margaret became a figure of respect and a pillar of strength in the community. The old chapel where she had faced down the creature became a symbol of their collective resilience, its doors always open, a place for those seeking solace or protection. But the shadows of Elmsbury were patient. They waited, as darkness always does, for the moment to strike. It was on the anniversary of that fateful night, under a full moon, that Margaret felt the stirring of something familiar, a chill that ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from the touch of the unseen. Standing in front of the chapel, she looked out at the town, feeling the weight of her years, but also the strength of her resolve. The shadows at the edges of the town seemed to quiver, as if in anticipation, but Margaret was not afraid. She held the cross from the chapel in one hand and her manuscript in the other, ready to defend her home should the need arise. "I am here," she whispered to the night, her voice steady and sure. "I am watching." And so, Elmsbury remained a place touched by both light and shadow, its peace hard-won and protected by the vigilance of those who remembered. Margaret lived out her days as the guardian of that peace, her legacy one of courage and light in the face of darkness. As the story of Elmsbury closes, the town continues to whisper its tales of shadows and light, of a woman who stood against the darkness. And somewhere, in the heart of the old town, in the pages of a dusty manuscript, lies the promise that no matter how deep the darkness grows, there will always be those who stand ready to bring forth the light. The end, though satisfying, carries with it a haunting reminder: in places like Elmsbury, the battle between light and dark is eternal, and the keepers of the light must always remain vigilant.